Welcome to the Q Podcast.
Q is about conversation.
If we're really concerned about ending poverty, we've got to be more concerned about creating justice.
Our cultural products as Christians need to both defy and resonate with the culture.
And God's doing amazing things. His church is expanding, his church is growing.
It's not what's the purpose of my life, it's what is the purpose that's been assigned.
Stay curious, think well, advance good. This is Q.
This is Gabe Lyons. Welcome to another edition of the Q Podcast. And man, I'm loving the conversations we're having on this podcast. For so many years, we've tried to bring you some of our best talks, and we're going to keep doing that. But today, I'm sitting down for 45 minutes with somebody who's been a mainstay in the Q Ideas space, being at so many of our events, written several books, been a part of many interviews. We've even done a whole podcast series together. But Dr. Preston Sprinkle, and we're talking about the important conversation around gender, which I know for many of us has been one of those educations over the last several years to better understand the topics, the terms, the experiences, the stories. No one's better than Preston at bringing those stories to light, helping us better understand how people who might be walking through gender dysphoria, who are wrestling with gender identity questions, who are trying to, they're stepping into like specific gender norms that exist in our culture. What of that is structures we've created? How much of that's biblical? How much of that's just something new in our culture? We're going to get into all of those conversations, and I'm excited to have him with us. He's a biblical scholar, a New York Times bestselling author, but also leads something. He's the president of the Center for Faith, Sexuality and Gender. And this is a center that he helped lead and create that has been such a resource for so many pastors and Christian leaders who are trying to navigate all of the tensions, all the difficult conversations around understanding Scripture, understanding theology, understanding the history of the Christian faith and how that relates to modern times. So I'd encourage you to learn more about that work there. But most recently, he just released a book called Embodied, Transgender Identities, the Church, and What the Bible Has to Say. So he's really stepped into this conversation in a way that I think so many Christian leaders need. Somebody who's willing to go there and help us understand and unpack a very, very complex topic, and something we've talked about at our Q Ideas events for many, many years, and tried to bring those different perspectives and help people meet those who are walking through these different experiences, but also apply it through this lens of what does Scripture say about this? How does God view this? How can we best understand that? How can we best lovingly and with compassion engage people who are struggling and walking through different experiences than maybe we are? And so I think today's just going to be that encouragement for you. If you have a friend or parents and you're talking about these kinds of conversations with your children or friends, I just think it's going to help you. It's going to give you insight. It's going to give you perspective on a lot of complexities. And so let's listen in now to this conversation with Dr. Preston Sprinkle. Preston, it is great to be back with you in the same room, having conversations about really important and very complex subject matter.
It's good to be back, man. The place hasn't changed a bit.
I know, man. Well, listen, I think our world's changed a little bit, but in some ways, not a lot's changed. There's a lot of conversation still happening around these difficult topics that not all of us know how to navigate well. I feel like you've been sitting in this place where you've studied it. You've tried to read everything from the history and the most scholarly works to the science, to the research, to the theology, going back to the Paul and the New Testament, the Old Testament. And that's what I love about what our listeners are getting to hear today is just kind of your take on some of this. And for those who haven't heard our series, Preston and I did a series 4 years ago called The Gay Conversation that still is probably one of our most listened to series on the Q Podcast. It's 6 different episodes where we really walk through the conversation around sexuality, around how do we think well about that. And we had 25 different voices weigh in. I mean, it was quite a project, but I found so many people to just say, hey, it was just helpful. It was great to have you guys having a reasonable conversation. You agreed on most things, maybe disagreed on some things, but for the most part, helpful because there's not a lot of places to go these days. So I'm excited for people to get to hear another conversation that you've been digging in really deep and understanding this subject that I have found most people would rather avoid talking about. But today we're going to talk about it. And it's the subject of gender. Gender used to not be a debated conversation, right? It's like man and woman,
Right.
boy and girl. And man, you look back over the last, it's probably been like 5 years. I know it was happening before that, but the last 5 years, it just took off.
Yeah.
2014, 15, it was the new conversation. We'd moved beyond gay rights in that conversation to what is gender, what are gender rights, how should we speak to people who want to be called by a different gender than maybe their biological gender. So it's a whole thing, and I just want us to think well about it today. And so thank you for being with us to talk about it. But first, tell us, why did you decide to go deep into this conversation after writing a book called People to Be Loved, which really dealt with the issue of how do we think about sexuality?
Yeah.
Why did you decide to go to gender? Because it's a different topic.
Yeah. I'll never forget sitting outside the front house of a buddy of mine who happens to be a gay guy who's Christian, conservative theologically. And it was fall of 2014. So I was getting ready to submit my manuscript for People to Be Loved on homosexuality. And he said, Preston, by the time your book comes out, the sexuality conversation is going to take a backseat to the gender conversation. That was 2014.
Yeah.
And, he's a pretty smart guy, so I kind of took his word for it. But sure enough, pretty much right around the time my book came out, people were already starting to ask more questions about gender, transgender, and other categories like, non-binary, gender queer, gender fluid, and the list keeps expanding, and as does the confusion over what these categories even mean. And yeah, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, the last 3 or 4 years especially, the transgender and related conversations have just really, really taken off. I think some of that has to do with, same-sex marriage being legalized at a federal level in 2015. And so that was kind of a major accomplishment, what so many gay and lesbian people have been working for. I talked to some gay people in the community, and, they're kind of like, yeah, we're there, kind of like, there's still difficulties, but we've kind of arrived. But meanwhile, trans people are thinking, well, we haven't, and we still have a lot more things that we want to try to fight for. So even on a cultural level, there's been a lot of movement. But with that movement has come a lot of confusion, a lot of confusion.
And that's what I want to do today is I want to get into that confusion. I want to kind of see if we can get a little order out of the chaos that it feels this conversation brings up, which is why so many people just avoid it. But I know there's so many parents now who have children who are educating them, right? The children are saying, this is what this means. This is what I want. This is how I feel. This is how I want to think about this. And so you have parents confused because they want to be kind, loving. They care so deeply for their child. They're not going to let these labels get in the way of relationship. Right. And so one of the things we kind of broke down in that series was just this framework that I'd laid out in our book that David Kinnaman and I did together called Good Faith. And it's the idea that we should use these lenses to think through how do we approach difficult issues. And the first frame, the first lens is theology. Like that's the foundation. Like our first job as Christians is to go, what is God's view of this? And how do I know that? Through Scripture, through the church fathers, through how we understand human beings and how we were designed to function, how sin has distorted that in some ways and disordered it. And so I want to start there with you on this conversation of gender so we can just have kind of some solid footing, understand how you're seeing it, and go back to the source, right? God's design, which I realize will be controversial, and people listening may not agree and may have different opinions, different sources, different ways they're going to think about it. But at Q, we're trying to bring this historic Christian understanding into the modern world. And so I want to kind of hear how you've unpacked that and how should we approach this from a theological perspective?
Yeah, thank you for that. And let me begin by giving the major caveat by saying, kind of reiterating what you just said, that look, I've spent the last several years reading everything I can get my hands on this topic, but also conversing with many transgender, non-binary identified people to hear their stories and listen to their experience. I don't think experience should determine what we believe, but it should kind of shape how we believe it. So everything I'm going to say is going to be controversial. There's not a word that's going to come out of my mouth that's not debated by somebody, but I've done my best to try to approach this fairly biblically and sensitively to the people who have this experience. So theologically, the basic question we're asking is, what does it mean to be human? Or more specifically, what does it mean to be a sexed, embodied human being? We have bodies. Bodies are essential to our human identity. And that's not really controversial from a Christian perspective. But our bodies come in sexed forms, male and female. And let me say this, and this might raise more questions we can maybe get to, but 99.99% of people are either male or female biologically.
There's the intersex category that is true for some people that are just born that way with both genitalia, correct?
Right, exactly, yeah. And that is, and it, I hate even saying, it's such a small percentage. I don't say that to therefore say we shouldn't care about it. I have a few friends who are intersex and they're both male and female. And that's just who they are.
That's how they were born.
There's a lot of intersex people that aren't. It's such a minor variation that they're still clearly male or female. But so almost every human is going to be clearly male or female. Now, another thing to understand as we even approach the theology is how many people are distinguishing between sex and gender. Up until the 1960s, say, sex and gender were synonyms. Sex, gender, you can use them just interchangeably to refer to whether you're male or female. On forms,
that's how they were used, right?
Totally,
They just all meant the same thing.
But beginning in the late 60s, and I'll save you from all the history. You can go on Wiki or something and get the history of this. But scholars in the field, psychologists and sexologists, began to make a distinction between sex and gender. So now sex means biological sex. Your chromosomes, your reproductive structures, what makes our bodies different from between male and female. Gender people use in a few different ways. The two main ways are one, gender identity, which has to do with one's internal sense of who they are. So more the psychological response to your embodied sex. Then there's gender roles that has to do with kind of the cultural expectations of what it means to be a male or female, or to use a shorthand, masculinity and femininity. And here's where a lot of the confusion starts. Somebody says, I think Facebook says there's 74 different gender options, and some people flip out. There's only 2 genders. I'm like, okay, calm down. Let's just, You have to understand that the term gender is used by, 10 different people in 11 different ways today. So at least ask what the person means by gender. Because if you define gender, as many people do, as one's internal sense of who they are, then there's probably 7 billion gender identity. When you make it so subjective and individual, that's why people are saying there's so many different gender identities. They're not saying it's unscientific to say there's 74 different biological sexes. That's just, that's flat earth theology. Well, I get emails from the Flat Earth Society, so I guess there are some people who wouldn't, anyway. So understanding how people use the terms sex and gender differently is so essential for even engaging this conversation.
But going back to the theological point, God made them male and female, right? Right. There wasn't a gender conversation happening in Scripture, right?
Exactly. The Bible doesn't entertain that distinction between sex and gender. Now, it does talk about, when it says God created the male and female, Genesis 1:27, and it links our male and femaleness to how we bear God's image. That's probably the most fundamental theological starting point, is that our biological sex is intertwined with the divine identity that we've been stamped with. This is not superficial. This is not just icing on the cake. This is really a significant part of our humanity. Now, does the Bible address gender as something different than sex? It does kind of talk about, I would say maybe indirectly, it does talk about masculinity and femininity without using those categories.
Yeah, gender roles and
different
stuff, expectations culturally that are put on women and men.
But what I love about the Bible is that it gives us a lot of liberty on those. I mean, you have some women that stay at home and make babies, and that's a very stereotypically feminine thing to do. You also have women that drive tent pegs through men's skulls and win wars and are successful businesswomen like Lydia in Acts 16. So these narrow gender stereotypes that our culture and sometimes the church reinforces, the Bible actually says, most men might act masculine. Some men, like David, play a harp and write poetry and weep over their best friend Dave or Jonathan, So I think the Bible does not actually reinforce these gender stereotypes, which I think is really helpful. And especially in this conversation, because I think some people, in some cases, people could search for an alternative gender identity when they feel like they don't conform to these narrow stereotypes. So the church can step in and say, no, you're you can be a male or a female, and you can be a male that likes art and not sports, and that's totally fine.
Right. Or you can be a female who's athletic and enjoys sports or enjoys fishing or hunting.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean you're not a woman or you weren't born with the right body, right?
Exactly.
But let's talk about though where does the distortion start to happen though for people? I get that the one area can be just the cultural stereotypes we've put around people, and so they're like, get me out of this box because that's not who I am, and I don't see any category I can find. And now the world's saying, hey, there's more categories. You being you can be something different than what you've been told you had to be. But where does it sort of theologically get off, in your opinion? Where do we as human beings start to basically see it differently than maybe how God wanted us to see it?
Yeah. There's that's a great question. There's two kind of directions where something like a gender dysphoria might come from, or just let's say alternative identities. One is from the cultural pressure to conform to these stereotypes, which we talked about. But then there's also for some people, it comes from within. Like I know people that from the time they were 3 years old had debilitating gender dysphoria, where they just literally feel like they're living inside of somebody else's body. And I've heard of people as young as 6 years old become suicidal because they just feel horrified. They look in the mirror and they feel like they're looking at somebody else. So this isn't just them, not matching up to the stereotypes. This is a serious psychological condition. According to the most authoritative source I know, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM 5th edition, they say anywhere from 0.005 to 0.014% of the population has been tested for gender dysphoria.
Yeah, and define gender dysphoria.
Gender dysphoria is just the feeling of distress that comes with experiencing an incongruence between your biological sex and your internal sense of who you are. And honestly, beyond that, it's even specialists are still trying to get their arms around it. We don't know what causes it.
Has this been happening throughout history?
Sure.
Do we have record that this percentage has stayed about the same? I mean, and we didn't have the data to do that, but as you're reading stories and understanding history, I know in the sexuality conversation, there's a lot there that you could see between same-sex relationships and other things happening. Do you see the same thing on this idea?
We do have several historical examples of people cross-identifying, cross-presenting. There's a famous Roman emperor from the 3rd century AD who used to go and just dress up as a woman and have sex with other men as a woman. Mm-hmm. And it's from the descriptions of this guy, some people say, oh, he must have been gay. It's like, I think he was probably some kind of trans, So, but in terms of this psychological internal disposition, no, there's nothing that really documents that, but we do see the manifestation of what would probably be some kind of gender dysphoria. So yeah, there's nothing new under the sun. All these conditions that we have terms for now, I think, maybe to a lesser extent, maybe to a higher extent, they still have always existed.
It's definitely increasing the number of people who are identifying. So you could either say, hey, there's a sense of more freedom to just identify as whatever I want in this particular society. So people have always felt this way and haven't been able to identify. Or you could say the imagination's being changed and people start to have an imagination, even from young ages, that they could be different. They could be born in the wrong body. They're being taught that in some ways, that maybe you should question that about yourself. And so kids are asking themselves questions that perhaps 20, 30 years ago, we would have never even thought to ask.
Yeah, we definitely have new categories now that we didn't have before. And so you have people, you have a massive increase in people identifying. It is important to make a distinction between transgender and transgender-related identities and those who have a psychologically diagnosed condition of gender dysphoria. So let's go back to that percentage, 0.014% on the high end with gender dysphoria. And let's just say, we can quadruple that number. Let's just say 0.05%, Well, anywhere from, 0.6 to 0.7 of the population, adult population, identifies as transgender. That's what, I'm giving a round number, 10 times higher than those who might have gender dysphoria. Then when it comes to teenagers, you have like anywhere from 2 to 4% identifying as trans. So then you have an age difference here. You have a way higher percentage of younger, Gen Z identifying as trans or non-binary. And so
And
certainly
some of that, though, I mean, I know there's even a new category for some of what's happening, and this is a sensitive thing to talk about because, again, what you're saying and what I think is important for us to see is that people who are identifying in this way, the feelings are real, right? And
Sure.
and I know there's this phrase my friend Ben Crane has talked about a lot, that feelings are real. They're not always reliable, but they're real. And so we don't want to discount feelings. We don't invalidate that somebody feels this way. But at the same point, we're seeing a major increase in the people who are feeling this way. That from my view, feels like the culture's part of this, the imagination's part of this, the entertainment, the art, the expression, and all of that sort of feeds something that says, hey, this is possible. And I didn't even know this was possible. And so some would look at that and go, that's great. That's the kind of world I want to live in, where anything's possible and I can be whoever I want. But then when you look back at sort of Christian theology and history, you go, there are actually some constraints that are good for me as a human being, that when I live with self-constraint, or I don't just follow what I'm feeling, that may produce more flourishing for me and more abundance. And, what is your take on that?
Yeah, well, you're entering into a hotly disputed conversation about the role that society plays in nudging these feelings, or even pushing people towards identifying. And certainly, on some level, both nature and nurture are interacting here. But when it comes to teenagers identifying, there has been such a massive increase that even very liberal, non-religious people are saying there has to be at least some level of societal, or some people call it a social contagion, that is influencing people to look at their bodies and not feel like this is who they really are.
Yeah,
and
there's a name. Isn't there a name for it called rapid onset? What is it?
Yeah, rapid onset gender dysphoria is a term that was coined by a psychologist from Brown University named Lisa Littman, who produced a. I think it's a really good study. It's been critiqued, but I've read the critiques, read her response. I think it's a solid study where she looked at this massive increase among females, especially teenage females, identifying as something other than by their biological sex. And she's identifying that in many of these cases, they had an underlying mental health issue. Autism is, in one gender clinic in the UK, 50% of the people that came in for gender identity issues also were on the autism spectrum. Another study said, if you have gender dysphoria, you're 7 times more likely to be on the autism spectrum, 4 times more likely to have a multiple personality disorder, borderline personality disorder. And then depression and suicidality, and there's all kinds of mental health issues. And is it causation or correlation? And we can't say for sure, but somehow these other mental health issues are intertwined, at least, with their
and
trans
we know
identity.
For all of us growing up, we wanted to be accepted. We want to have identities. We, whether I was an athlete growing up and that was a big deal to me, or, somebody was, a great artist. And there's ways in which these social groups form. And I think we're just seeing some different types of groupings form. And again, it's not to discount that these feelings aren't real, that kids aren't desiring to just be themselves as they've been told they can be. But we're certainly in a new world now where that is more normal, where kids are having to learn how to, talk to one friend one way one year and then call them by a different name the next year. And for those kids, I've had them, in my home where we're having conversations about that. And it can be very confusing. They don't quite understand. They just know they're supposed to follow along. And so I think for people who are parents and are walking through this with their kids, I think for pastors, ministers, youth leaders, people on campuses who are trying to build relationships with a new generation, you have to know how to think through this one. It's one of those questions that a lot of our youth have, and they want to know, well, is it really a big deal that somebody wants to identify differently than their biological sex? Like, how big of a deal should we make of that? Is it a sin, or is it just kind of a thing, and we shouldn't make too much of it?
Yeah, and that's how I think a lot of even Christians are thinking. The one thing, going back to the theology, is that the Bible is pretty clear on this, that our bodies are significant. Our bodies belong to God. And you see in Paul's letters, you see in Genesis that, our bodies are part of our identity. The Bible doesn't place a lot of stock in our kind of internal sense of who we are. It puts a lot of stock in who God tells us who we are, so our bodies aren't just superfluous. Like what you do with your body, and this applies to many other areas that we can even get into outside the trans conversation, but what we do with our bodies, these are moral decisions,
Including tattoos?
I mean, yeah, we can have that discussion, but I think, anybody should at least ask that question.
Piercings. Sure. I mean, anything with your body matters. Our bodies matter. They're part of what God's created.
I don't like the moral thinking that, it's just my body, therefore I can. That sentence is not a Christian sentence. This is God's body, therefore I must ask God, seek his word to see, is this something he would want me to do with my body? So, going back to the social contagion thing, we know that things like eating disorders or even body dysmorphia or suicidality, these clearly happen in clusters or social influence. So we know that the way teenagers reflect on their bodies can be significantly influenced by the culture. Now, I want to point out, I don't know if I made this clear earlier, that you have some teenagers that are highly influenced by their cultural surroundings, online communities, social communities at school. Then you have other people who just have this debilitating psychological condition since they're 3 years old.
Right.
And we don't want to cross those. We don't want to pastorally address somebody who might be heavily influenced by their culture or assume that when the person's actually wrestling with a really significant psychological condition.
Yeah, so that's an important thing to identify. It's not to just assume everybody's on the same journey on this conversation, but that each person's unique. I think that's something that's really been a feature of your work as we've talked about sexuality, is how every person's unique, their story's unique, their journey's unique. And the more you understand that story, the better you can minister and help and support and care for and love and welcome in. So continuing on, so in the ministry side, I mean, that's what you're talking into. In this framework, we have theology, ministry, relationships, politics, and the public square. So those are kind of the 5 layers that I think when we think about any cultural issue or topic, we kind of want to put it through that lens as we play out how we should faithfully live and how should we faithfully engage this topic. But we could all disagree as we kind of move out from theology. I think as Christians, it's probably agreeable that we land on this is what God's design is. Now, of course, there's still debates about that. There will be disagreement, but ideally there's agreement. This is what God's vision is for this. And then we just understand with compassion that because of the way this world works, like there's all kinds of ways in which we get some of that off and wrong. It's not always our fault. It's just part of the world that we're in. And so good ministry is what you just described. It's coming into that situation, understanding the story and saying, how do I pastorally care best for this individual? And could you share a story maybe of where you've seen a church leader, a pastor, a parent care well for a person who was going through and experiencing maybe gender dysphoria and confusion about what they were feeling, and through that proper care and love, that person came out feeling way more supported and loved and possibly gained more clarity?
Well, yeah, I've got too many stories that I could almost, it's hard to pick a single one, but as I think through various stories where churches have done this well, and not just churches, but say parents and leaders and mentors and so on, I think really listening is the number one key. And this is really frustrating for people that do have gender dysphoria or are just confused about who they are, when people who aren't confused, people like you and I, that we've never had to even think about, like, am I really a male, and what am I doing in this body? Like we don't even know what that feels like, and that's because we don't know what it feels like. I think we need to take that posture of deep, intense, genuine, really listening to somebody's experience. And when someone feels listened to, then they feel seen. When they feel seen, they feel loved, and only when they feel loved are they going to invite you to continue into this journey of a really difficult path. Some people, they live their entire lives with gender dysphoria. And, it can be really excruciating. So whatever kind of discipleship counsel we're trying to offer the person, it needs to come from a place of humility, acknowledging that we just don't understand, this experience.
Yeah, I remember at Q this past year, the story of Kat and Lori as friends, where Kat had gone to a counselor, experiencing these feelings, and tell that story of how she felt after she was counseled.
So Kat had recently come out as trans. She had been wrestling with dysphoria for a long time, didn't have a name for it. And she wasn't walking with the Lord, raised in a church, but wasn't, walking with Christ. And she ended up going to her secular counselor who, when the counselor heard that that she was identifying as trans, the counselor was kind of like, oh, well, let's get you on testosterone. Let's start, the transition process. If you're trans, this is the best thing for you. And Kat recalls later that she felt a little bit unloved. Like she knew that she was going through lots of stuff and there was lots of layers to this. And the counselor, unintentionally, but I think just thought the quick fix is let's just change your body, And shortly after, she ended up going to a church and God really struck her at church, just single-handedly invaded her life. And in that moment when Kat was just being drawn to the Lord, a Christian who happened to be same-sex attracted and married to a dude and have 3 kids together, long story. And she reached out to Kat and just said, hey, I noticed you come to church alone. I would love for you to sit with our family if you ever want. That's my husband over there. Our kids would love for you to sit with us. And she had to be persistent. At first, Kat didn't really, buy it, but she's like, no, this woman is genuine. She actually wants me to sit with her family. Like, wow, and it was that extension of love that really drew Kat in, not to having her theology all worked out, but it invited her into a discipleship journey. I'll never forget when Kat, in a frustrated conversational moment, told Lori, you know what, I'm so sick and tired of what everybody says about my gender. I want to know, what does God think? Lori, what does God think? And Lori didn't say, well, let's go to Genesis or Leviticus says. She said, you know what, I'm not quite sure, but I would love to find out with you. And it was that expression of theological humility that allowed Kat to say, I can trust this person. If Lori had all the right answers right up front, I'd probably not even trust her. The fact that she had the humility to say, I'm not quite sure, but let's search the scriptures together. And now, that was 2 years ago. Kat's one of those zealous believers I've ever met. She tells
It's just an
everybody
amazing story of that basic idea of ministry, walking alongside somebody, letting God do the work of ministering to them, but you being a conduit of love. Moving into relationships, and I think it builds on the story of Lori and Kat, friendships, family members. As you counsel parents who have children experiencing any form of this, let's go with the form that maybe is less rooted in since the age of 3 feeling these things to maybe it's more current. It's in the last couple of years, they've basically started talking to their parents and just saying, I don't want to be my biological sex anymore. I don't want to be a boy, even though I might be male. I want to identify as a girl. How do parents best love their kids through that?
No, this is the number one hardest question I'm facing now, because some teenagers in this situation are so adamant that, and I hate to say it, but there's not much you can do. If you try to steer them away or try to raise some even good, honest questions about that whole paradigm, sometimes it can have a negative reaction. And part of the problem is that there are many online communities that are, I hate even saying this, but just really brainwashing kids. They'll even tell them, like, if your parent doesn't give you hormones immediately, then they're transphobic and they're just going to increase your suicidality. They're toxic and you need to get away from toxic relationships so you don't kill yourself.
Wow.
And so when a teenager is being bathed in this, and then the parent, if they raise any questions, they're like, oh, yep, that online community is correct. Toxic parent, I'm going to kill myself. I need to get out of this house, get away, cut them off. And that can be incredibly hard. So I would advise parents of teenagers, not to transition their kid, not to allow or sign off on invasive medical procedures, but somehow try to delay those irreversible lifelong decisions that many teenagers are making now. It's really sad. Yeah,
and we're finding, some of the data and research and those who've done these surgeries are coming out now saying, I felt like now that I'm older and wiser and I've lived a little bit of life, I wish I wouldn't have made that decision so quickly.
Yeah. A lot of so-called detransitioners who transition and now are going back are young females in their early 20s, and they're calling the year 2020 the year of the detransitioners.
Really?
If you just type in detransitioning in YouTube, you'll see a ton of testimonies, but look at the dates of those testimonies. They're all like 1, 2, 3, 4 months old. There's just an explosion of these coming out, and they're almost all like young females.
They basically, as females, felt like they wanted to be male in high school or middle school or whatever, and now they're in college age and they're going, I regretted doing that, and I want to get back to my biological sex.
So I'd recommend if you're a parent who has a teenager who is really adamant that they're want to transition or aren't their biological sex. Sometimes a parent can't really say a whole lot, but if they watch these testimonies of people who have been through that, it can resonate with so much what the teenager's going through, and yet would say, you know what, let's put the brakes on making some radical decisions here, because your body really does matter, and some of these surgeries and things you're going to do to your body can be not only really harmful in the long run, but they're irreversible.
And I think that's part of our goal here is it's better for just everybody to hear different stories. I mean, you've learned a lot. I know I've learned a lot hearing stories that maybe weren't as familiar to me, and it's brought on a great sensitivity, exposure, better understanding. But a lot of times in this cultural moment, certain stories aren't out there, and we're not hearing those stories as much. They're not as prominent. Your kids and teenagers maybe don't realize some people have detransitioned. And so as they're walking through it, if we're really concerned about truth, with them having full information for decisions that they're making, just understand there's groups like this out here that Preston can make us more familiar with that can help in that process. So continuing on, the relationship side, there's a lot of angles to that. There's teenagers who want to be good friends to their friends, but they don't always understand this, and they just want to support them and show up for them and love them and advocate for them, and that's a natural thing to do. But as we move into the fourth framework, politics, and the LGBT movement, for a while, all this was really combined, but then the last few years, you actually started to see there being some breakaway here, where some of the gay community were saying, look, transgender is not necessarily the same thing as what we're walking through, and yet the groups are molded together, and they've done that so that they can pursue certain rights and certain laws and get the same kind of treatment under the law. And yet you see even some infighting in that political space. But what's kind of the latest front as we think about this political front that those who are transgender are wanting and are looking for? I know for a season it was access to bathrooms and the ability to not be discriminated against in public bathrooms. It seems like that kind of settled down a little bit, and now we've moved on from that, and a lot of facilities are available that allow for both sexes, and it's kind of become not as big of a deal. But what are the latest places where you're seeing a political movement happen around this particular issue?
One of the biggest myths in this conversation is that there is such a thing as the LGBT community, as if they're all on the same page. There's a lot on a political or cultural level. There's all kinds of internal tensions, primarily between the LGB and the T. And not so much all the LGBT and T people, but some of the activists. Okay, so there's a growing movement of lesbians who are saying we don't belong in this community anymore because it's once again dominated by male-bodied people who want access to female-only spaces. So some of the most outspoken opponents of some of the radical trans activists are lesbian feminists.
Yeah. Which we had one at Q, a couple years ago, who just gave a great point where, as a lesbian woman, she was fighting against wanting to have males who identify as women in women's locker rooms and in those spaces, because she said, look, this is one of the last preserved spaces where females can show up, can take a shower, can feel like they have some privacy. And now biological men are showing up in that space. And of course, that's wildly controversial. And she was kind of blacklisted from LGBT parades and all kinds of things for saying that. But that is a conversation that's coming to the fore more now.
You even have public figures who aren't Christians, people like Douglas Murray, who's gay, or Andrew Sullivan, who's gay, and other public figures, lots of lesbian public figures and feminists that are not at all religious, not at all conservative, that are questioning some of the, again, they're not transphobic as some people say, they're just questioning some of the radical trans ideology, which has an impact on people's lives. We're seeing up in Canada that the criterion to determine whether you're a man or a woman is whether you say you're a man or a woman. So they're having a big problem in prisons. You have males predators, sex offenders, who are coming out and saying, well, I'm a woman, and they're literally being transferred to women's prisons. And it's a huge problem.
We've seen the same thing happen in athletics and sports where, male-bodied individuals are showing up in women's sports and
breaking
athletics.
the faces of people.
Yeah. It was like an MMA fight where this male-bodied, identifying as a female, like broke the neck or skull or something.
Broke the face of a girl.
Face of a woman.
Same thing in soccer.
Who was like the top female. And so these things start to become obvious that this doesn't all line up. It doesn't make sense. And yet our society's at a place, and this is where I want to move into the public square, where they're saying if you don't go with this, then you're the hater, you have a phobia, you're transphobic, you're homophobic. If you question anything now in this sort of space, you're the enemy, right? You're the worst person ever to even raise that there could be another point of view. And that's the concern about where we're going on these basic ideas, basic logic, some basic truths. And of course, we need to be sensitive to understand people are coming from different experiences. But as Christians, it's okay to believe a certain way and to not need to back away from like what you believe to be true and what you believe will lead to human flourishing. And my concern is when we start to fake that and we start to play along with things that actually aren't necessarily true, but we're just saying it because we want to socially fit in, we actually start playing into a distortion and we normalize it. And it's really our kids and their kids that grow up in a world where there's deeper confusion.
And one thing that Christians need to understand is, unlike the same-sex marriage debates, which were pretty much divided between liberals and conservatives, right? If you're a conservative, you were probably for traditional marriage. If you were liberal, of course, you'd be for same-sex marriage. When it comes to some of the fundamental questions about what it means to be human in this conversation, there's loads of very liberal people who are questioning this kind of radical trans ideology. Now, I keep using that phrase, radical trans ideology. We can't associate it with, all the liberals think this. There was a study done a while back that surveyed how many people would kind of be thinking along these kind of hyper-progressive lines, and I think it was like 8% of the population. If you're on Twitter, you feel like it's like 75%, but it's not. The average person looks at a man and woman and says, these are kind of basic categories. Most people are kind of scared to say anything. But I don't know. I think this radical ideology that tries to say there's no differences between a man and a woman, your bodies are irrelevant, you can just change them around. I think that's a small yet very loud and very powerful minority voice. So we'll see. And in 2 to 5 years, it'll be interesting to see, even on a cultural level, where it's going to be. There's enough very liberal voices speaking out. If you look at even like in Sweden and the UK, New Zealand, some places outside of America, these very liberal voices are starting to help people to rethink some of these things, and they're making some changes. It's
becoming okay to question a few of these areas and not just to shut up and follow along with where this narrative's going. Well, you've just completed your latest book on this. Talk to us about the title of that book and why you wrote the book and what your hope is for this project. And as you think about the leaders listening to this who lead institutions, colleges, humanitarian organizations, churches, entrepreneurs who are leading staff. So they're working with all kinds of people in the public square, but they're also wanting to be faithful with, as Christians, how do we help these people the most? How could your book and this conversation play out for them and be helpful?
So thank you. The book is titled Embodied. The subtitle is Transgender Identities, the Church, and What the Bible Has to Say. So it summarizes a lot of what we've been talking about. It begins with just understanding the very categories and terms we're even talking about. So I spent a few chapters up front just really getting our arms around what is this conversation all about? What does it mean to be trans? Then I spent several chapters going into the Bible, looking at a biblical theology of being male and female. I respond to some gender affirming arguments, like what about the eunuch and where do intersex people come in? Or what if somebody's born with a male brain and a female body, or vice versa? Is that even a thing? I have a whole chapter looking at that. So I do a lot of, I would say 75% of the book is doing these really foundational questions.
Yeah, and exploring kind of the case studies and the different questions that are going to come up to challenge the argument.
And then the last third, I kind of say, okay, if this is true, I've kind of exhausted this whole understanding of what it means to be human in light of these conversations, then I ask practical questions like, what about pronouns, and what about transitioning into bathrooms, and what do you do at summer camp with sleeping arrangements and so on? So
it gets practical and helpful as people are navigating this. That's what I love about your work at the Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender. And you're 3.5, 4 years into this work, and you're creating papers, white papers. You're helping Christian leaders understand this conversation. And without you, I don't know where we'd be. I mean, there's few people who've been willing to step in and talk about this subject matter because for fear of being attacked, for being taken wrongly. And you have the thickest skin and the kindest heart to where I know it gets lonely getting into this conversation, and there's not a lot of other people you can talk about it with. But man, at Q, we just support you. We love you. We're so grateful that you've helped educate the leaders, not only listening here, but every year at our Q event, just being a part of these conversations because you're helping us be smarter. You're helping us think well, helping us stay historically rooted, like in Scripture. It matters what God thinks about this and His design, and we care about our neighbors flourishing, and it matters that we treat our neighbors well, that we love them well, that we're kind, that we're compassionate. And so you give us the ability to do all of that more. So thank you for being with us.
my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Well, I hope you enjoyed listening in on that conversation. And, the way we tried to do that around the theology piece, ministry, and then starting to understand how does this play out in our relationships, our politics, our public square. That was part of the original series Preston and I did together 5 years ago around sexuality you can find in our podcast episodes. But I want to remind you that Preston's going to be with us at our Q 2021 Culture Summit. April 22nd and 23rd, we're coming together, and we're doing it really bigger than ever. Unfortunately, the in-person part won't be as big as ever. That's going to be smaller than ever. But the outlet of this to every home, every church, every office space, collab space, wherever you can bring a few people together in a way that you're comfortable with to take in the dialogue and the conversations live and engage with those around you. That has always been the vision of Q. Our goal is that you don't just take in content, because we can all go to YouTube and take in content or read articles, but more that we're learning together and we're talking about it together. So there's going to be space for that. I'm also excited about something new we're able to do because of the virtual element we've never been able to do before. We're going to have these expert Q&As where we've invited 40 different leaders who are experts on so many topics, very much like what just happened here in this podcast experience. You got to talk to an expert. You got to listen in on his thoughts, his views. 40 leaders like Preston who are going to be a part of the conversations with you. You're going to get to directly interact, choose the different sessions that you want to interact with these leaders on, and all of the topics that you could imagine that we're going to talk about. Everything from technology and artificial intelligence to how do we think through this lens in a post-COVID world of what it means to gather, what it means to be the church. What does it mean for us to be faithful in the midst of tensions culturally? We're going to talk about everything from currency to, you name it, death and dying, and some of the deep, sad moments that we've all experienced in the last year. How do we be faithful? And so I hope you'll join us. Go to qideas.org/culture summit. Now, if you're like me, I'll tell you how to spell it. Summit, 2 M's, 1 T. It's that simple. Go to qideas.org/culture summit. You'll see all about the presentations that are confirmed. There's many more coming on, as well as our expert Q&As that we're building out right now, and they're awesome. And I hope that not only will you be a part of the conversations we're having through listening in, but that you'll interact with us, that you'll bring your voice to the conversation, you'll bring your questions, and we'll do our best to bring answers. I hope you have a wonderful day.